They laughed at him. The entire banquet hall, hardened warriors, battle-scarred elders, wolves who had howled at 100 moons, they all threw their heads back and laughed at a man who simply smiled. They called him soft. They called him a disgrace. Their alpha, Merrick, a wolf who had never once tasted defeat, pointed a thick finger across the hall and sneered. A king should lead the hunt, Vanya. Your husband can't even lead a dog to water. He belongs in the dirt. And Fenris? He didn't roar. He didn't shift. He picked up the herbs they'd thrown into the mud, washed them quietly, and when his mate came to him with tears burning in her eyes, he held her face in his hands and whispered, "A lion doesn't lose sleep over the opinion of sheep, my love. Let them have their noise." They thought his silence was weakness. They thought his gentleness was surrender. They thought the man who cooked their meals, healed their wounds, and tended their sick children was nothing. They were so catastrophically wrong. Because the night Merrick raised his hand against the one woman Fenris had crossed kingdoms to protect, the fire in the hearth turned silver, the ground trembled without an earthquake, and every ancient wolf in that room felt something slam into their chest like a divine fist, pure, primal, overwhelming terror. Not the terror of a beast, the terror of a king. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about power. Chapter 1. There are packs that survive by fang and claw, and then there is the Ironblood pack, which doesn't merely survive, it dominates. Their territory stretches across 4 mountain ranges and 2 river valleys, carved out through decades of conquest. Other packs speak their name carefully, the way you speak around a wound that hasn't healed. Rival alphas have tried to challenge them. Most never tried twice. The ones who didn't return home. Within those borders, a single law governs everything, unwritten, unspoken, but carved into the spirit of every wolf born under Ironblood skies. Strength is the only currency that matters. Show weakness and you lose your rank. Lose your rank and you lose your place at the table. Lose your place at the table and the pack forgets you exist. It is a system that produces ferocious warriors. It is also a system that produces something far more dangerous, wolves who have forgotten why they were fighting in the first place. Alpha Merrick sits at the center of it all, like a throne made of old wounds. Broad-shouldered, iron-jawed, with a laugh that sounds more like a warning. He did not inherit his position. He seized it bare-handed. At 17, and he has spent every year since, reminding his pack of exactly that. His respect is not given. It is extracted. Under his rule, the pack has never lost a territorial dispute. Under his rule, 3 healers have quietly left, 2 elders have stopped speaking at council, and 17 pups have grown up believing that crying is something only the broken do. These are not things Merrick tracks. These are not things Merrick considers losses. It is on an ordinary morning, frost still clinging to the grass, sun barely cresting the ridge, that we first see him. The warriors notice him the way they always do, with a slow, sliding contempt. He is crouched near the eastern wall of the compound, fingers deep in dark soil, carefully separating the roots of something small and green that nobody else has bothered to learn the name of. His sleeves are rolled to the elbow. There is a smear of earth across his forearm. He is, absurdly, humming something low and wordless, as though the garden is the only audience he requires. His name is Fenris. He is, by any measure that matters to the eye, a remarkably handsome man, the kind of face that would stop a room if he ever chose to command it. Strong jaw, dark hair, eyes the color of deep water just before a storm. But he never commands a room. He barely raises his voice above a conversation. He moves through the compound like a current beneath still water, present everywhere, visible nowhere. The warriors passing the garden exchange glances. One of them mutters something. Another snorts. It is the particular cruelty of people who have decided, without investigation, that a man who grows things cannot possibly be worth knowing. "There goes Vanya's houseplant," one says, just loud enough. Fenris does not look up. He continues humming. Across the compound, Vanya is returning from patrol. She is not a small woman in the presence of wolves. She is precisely as large as the space demands. Her rank is senior tracker, earned on 4 consecutive hunts where she brought back more than any warrior twice her size. The pack respects her with the tense, reluctant admiration they reserve for people they cannot dismiss. But the same pack that cheers her name after a hunt will spend the very next morning shaking their heads about her choice. What does she see in him? A she-wolf like that, wasted on something so soft. He can't even shift properly, can he? I've never seen him shift. She hears all of it, every syllable. And every syllable costs her something, a fragment of patience, a sliver of composure that she rebuilds in private, every night, so she can do it again the next morning. She rounds the corner and sees Fenris at the garden wall, still crouched, now cradling a small bundle of pale herbs wrapped in damp cloth. He looks up when he hears her boots, and the expression that crosses his face is so immediate and so unguarded that it still, after 3 years, catches her somewhere beneath the ribs. Just warmth. Just her. Like she is the only thing in his field of vision that matters. "You're back early," he says. Patrol was clean. She crouches beside him, glancing at the herbs. "What are those for?" "Calla's pup. The fever spiked again last night." He says it simply, without fanfare, the way another man might mention the weather. "This should bring it down by morning." Vanya is quiet for a moment. Calla is the mate of Ironblood's third-ranking warrior. Her pup has been sick for 2 weeks. The pack healer visited once, declared it manageable, and moved on. Nobody has visited since. Nobody, except Fenris, who has been there every other evening quietly, without announcement, without asking anything in return. She watches his hands move over the herbs, careful, certain, unhurried. "Do they know it's you?" she asks. "Calla's family, do they know where the medicine comes from?" He gives a small shrug. "Does it matter?" It does. It matters enormously. But she already knows the answer he will give her, so she doesn't press. This is the thing about Fenris, that she has never been able to explain to anyone who asks. He does not need to be seen. He is not building credit. He is not performing decency in exchange for recognition. He simply is. Solid and unmoving as bedrock beneath soil, holding everything up from a place so deep that no one thinks to look for him there. The invisible pillar does not announce itself. It only becomes visible when everything above it begins to crack. Tonight, somewhere inside the main hall, warriors are laughing loud, bright, careless, the kind of laughter that only lives in people who have never had to be afraid. Fenris wraps the herbs carefully. He stands. He stretches his back, brushes the earth from his palms, and looks out across the compound with those quiet, storm-deep eyes. And for just a moment, one fraction of a moment that Vanya will remember much later, when everything has changed, the air around him seems to still, not with weakness, with something ancient and waiting and impossibly patient. Then he smiles at her, picks up the bundle and says, "Come on, I made dinner." She follows him inside. The warriors keep laughing. Nobody asks where the healing herbs come from. They only ever notice when they stop. Chapter 2. The hunt had been a good one. You could tell by the noise that particular brand of loud that only exists in wolves who have drawn blood and want the world to know it. They came through the compound gates like a wave, all broad grins and rough shoves, replaying moments of the chase for anyone within earshot. 3 elk, clean kills. Marek's inner circle at its most insufferable, flushed with victory, untouchable in their own estimation, looking for somewhere to put the excess of themselves. They found it in the courtyard. Fenris had been there since dawn. 3 days prior, he had gone alone into the high forest past the ridge where the soil changed from clay to black earth, where the old-growth trees filtered light into something almost sacred. He knew exactly where to look. He always did. Yarrow near the northern stream, feverfew in the shadow of the gray stones. Valerian root, which takes patience to locate, and more patience still to harvest without damaging what remains. He had returned with a basket so full it barely closed. Now he sat cross-legged in the center of the courtyard, working through the collection, with the focused quiet of someone doing something that genuinely mattered. Each bundle sorted by purpose. Each stem checked for damage. His hands moved with a kind of literacy, reading the plants the way another man might read a map, knowing instinctively which would serve, which needed more drying, which to set aside. He did not hear them approach over his own concentration. The first sign was the shadow. Bran Marek's lead enforcer, a wolf built like a barn door, and about as thoughtful, stopped a few feet away. He looked down at the basket, then at Fenris, then back at the basket, with the slow, arriving smirk of someone who has just decided to enjoy himself. "What is all this?" he said. Fenris looked up. "Medicine. For the eastern quarters, there are 4 cases of lung fever developing. I want to get ahead of it before." "Medicine." Bran said the word the way you'd repeat a joke you didn't quite catch. He looked back at his companions. He said medicine. The laughter came like a reflex. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Bran's boot connected with the side of the basket, not a nudge, but a full, deliberate swing, and 3 days of careful work exploded into the air. Herbs scattered across the mud. The basket tumbled and cracked against the stone wall. Stems that had taken hours to locate were ground instantly beneath shifting boots as the warriors pushed forward to get a better view of the entertainment. The laughter grew. Fenris looked at the courtyard floor. He did not shout. He did not stand. He did not bare his teeth or curl his hands into fists. He simply reached forward, picked up the nearest stem, turned toward the stone water basin at the courtyard's edge, and began, quietly, methodically, to wash it. The laughter faltered, slightly confused by the absence of reaction, needing the reaction to sustain itself. Bran watched Fenris kneel in the mud, retrieving herb after herb with the same unhurried movements, and felt, briefly and uncomfortably, something he would not examine closely. He covered it by laughing harder. Vanya came through the eastern gate at a run. She had not been there. She had been filing patrol reports with Elder Sira, 3 buildings away, but sound travels in a compound built from stone, and she knew the specific frequency of that laughter. Had learned it the way you learn to recognize the sound of something breaking. She crossed the courtyard in seconds and took in the scene in one sweep. The scattered herbs, the mud-caked stems, Bran and his circle still grinning, and Fenris on his knees at the basin, sleeves soaked, quietly cleaning what they had destroyed. Something ignited in her chest. Bran. Her voice came out low. That particular low that her patrol unit had learned to respect immediately. The kind of quiet that precedes violence, the way stillness precedes a storm. Bran turned, registered her face, had the sense at least to straighten slightly. Vanya, we were just... I know exactly what you were doing. She stepped forward. Those herbs were for the eastern quarters. People are sick. Children are sick. And you thought it was funny to... Easy. Bran held up a hand, a mistake, as it happened, because her eyes dropped to it like she was measuring the distance to his wrist. It's just plants, Vanya. Tell your human to grow more. She moved. A hand closed around her arm. Not grabbing, never grabbing. Just present, warm, certain. She turned. Fenris was standing beside her, dripping from the basin, holding a cleaned bundle of yarrow in his free hand. His expression was not pleading. It was not afraid. It was simply settled. Like a man who has already decided this moment does not own him. He looked at her and barely shook his head. She felt the fire in her chest collide with something immovable. She held Bran's gaze for 3 more seconds, long enough for him to understand clearly what she was choosing not to do, and then turned away. Bran's laughter resumed behind them, quieter now, less certain of itself. Their room, later, smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke. Fenris had salvaged most of it, not all, but most. The bundles now hung in careful rows from the ceiling beams, drying. He had said very little on the walk back. He rarely said much after moments like those. It was Vanya who broke. She sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on her knees, face in her hands, and the sound she made was not quite crying. It was something angrier than grief, and more exhausted than rage. The sound of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long. I should have let myself hit him, she said. Her voice was raw. He deserved it. They all deserve it. And you just knelt, Fenris. In the mud, in front of all of them. The mattress shifted as he sat beside her. He didn't offer empty reassurance. He didn't tell her it was fine, because he had too much respect for her to lie so plainly. He simply gathered her in one arm around her shoulders, his chin resting against her hair, and let the silence hold them both for a moment. Then, quietly, real power isn't the ability to kill, my love. A pause not for effect, but because he meant every syllable. It's the strength to stay gentle when you have every reason not to be. She closed her eyes. Outside, the compound settled into its nighttime sounds. Distant laughter from the main hall. A wolf calling to another across the ridge. The ordinary noise of a pack that had no idea what it was living beside. Fenris held her, and said nothing more, and the fire in the hearth burned low and steady. And somewhere in the quality of his stillness, in the total, unshakable calm of a man who had just been humiliated and was not, by any visible measure, diminished, something whispered at the edges of the scene. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting a very long time to stop being patient. Chapter 3. Merrick did not lose his temper often. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. They assumed a wolf built the way he was built, all mass and menace, with a voice that could silence a room from across it, must operate from rage. But rage is imprecise. Rage makes mistakes. Marek had not held this territory for 15 years by making mistakes. What he operated from was something colder, more deliberate. Calculation. And on the morning after Vanya nearly put her fist through Bran's jaw in the courtyard, on the morning after she chose, again, to defend that quiet, unhurried man over the dignity of pack culture, Marek sat alone in his war room and calculated. She was becoming a problem. Not because of her skill. Her skill was an asset he had no interest in discarding. Not because of her rank, senior tracker was not a position easily replaced. The problem was the signal she was broadcasting every single day, simply by existing in the choices she made. When a wolf of Vanya's standing looked at a man like Fenris and said, "This is worth my loyalty," other wolves noticed. Younger ones especially. Wolves still deciding what to value, still assembling their internal hierarchy of what respect was supposed to look like. She was, without intending to, suggesting an alternative. Marek could not allow an alternative. He leaned back in his chair, fingers laced across his chest, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he sent for his inner circle. The announcement came at midday, from the central platform where all formal pack declarations were made. Marek stood above the gathered wolves with the comfortable authority of someone who has never once questioned whether the ground belongs to him. His voice carried easily, it always did. The lunar banquet, he declared, would be held at the next full moon, 6 days from now. A sacred gathering, a celebration of the pack's strength and unity. He smiled as he said it, and the smile looked genuine, which was the most dangerous thing about it. Every wolf and their bonded mate would attend. And this year, given how much the pack had grown, how many new bonds had formed, there would be a formal acknowledgement. Each mate would be presented to the pack, would be given the opportunity to demonstrate their contribution, their value, their worthiness to stand beside an iron-blood wolf. He used that word carefully. Opportunity. It was not a test, he said. It was a celebration. The gathered wolves responded with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from not yet knowing what the words actually mean. Afterward, in the inner chamber, with the door closed and only his most trusted circle present, Marek did not use the word opportunity. He used the word evidence. "If he fails publicly," Marek said, his voice level and almost bored, "pack law does the rest. A mate who cannot contribute to pack function forfeits the bond's protection. Vanya knows the law. She's never needed to think about it before." He paused. "She'll think about it now." Bran nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means a person is assembling their admiration into an expression. "And if she tries to intervene?" "Then she invokes it herself. A wolf who defends an unworthy mate is making a declaration about her own judgment." Marek picked up the goblet on the table beside him. "Either way, the pack sees it. Either way, the conversation ends." He took a slow drink. 6 days. Make sure the hall is arranged for maximum witness. I want every ranking wolf present." Vanya heard the announcement from 50 feet away, standing near the training yard gate. She heard the words formal presentation, demonstrated value, worthy to stand beside, and felt the architecture of it land in her chest before her mind had fully caught up, felt the shape of it, the targeted precision of it. She could not prove intent. That was the elegant cruelty of Marek's method. He never left fingerprints. The law he was invoking was real, ancient, applied to genuine situations across pack history. He was simply redirecting it, using it the way a river can be redirected with the right placement of stones. She spent the afternoon running through every angle. If she refused to bring Fenris, she was in violation of the attendance mandate, punishable by rank reduction. If she brought him and he struggled under public scrutiny, pack law's enforcement provisions activated automatically. If she intervened to prevent his assessment, she was declaring her own bond defective. Every corridor closed. She found Elder Sira near the library archive and stood in the doorway for a long moment, trying to decide what to say. Sira looked up at her with those careful, unreadable eyes and said, simply, "I know. Is there a legal challenge to the format?" "Not one that can be filed in 6 days." Vanya pressed her hand flat against the doorframe. "He's going to use the full provision, isn't he? Not just the presentation. He's going to push until—" "Yes," said Sira quietly. A long silence stretched between them. "Then I need to warn Fenris." Sira was quiet for a moment too long. "Does Fenris," she said, choosing each word with visible care, "strike you as a man who requires warning?" Vanya didn't answer. She left. She found him in the corridor near the younger wolves' quarters. He was crouched beside a 17-year-old named Cole, one of the newest additions to the pack's junior ranks, carefully demonstrating how to tie the ceremonial knot required for formal gatherings. Cole's version had come out lopsided, then backwards, then somehow both simultaneously, and Fenris was showing him again with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be. Left over right, Fenris was saying. Then underneath, and through. Don't pull yet, just hold. Cole's tongue appeared between his teeth in concentration. Fenris looked up when Vanya stopped in the hallway. Read her face in under a second. She had never been able to hide much from him, and then returned his attention to Cole's fumbling hands. I heard the announcement, he said. We need to talk about it. We do. He guided Cole's fingers into the correct position. After dinner. Fenris. The knot first. A quiet instruction to Cole then. To her. I'm aware of what's happening, Vanya. Something in his tone made her pause. He helped Cole pull the knot snug, clean, symmetrical, perfect, and the younger wolf beamed with disproportionate pride. Fenris clapped him once on the shoulder, told him to practice it 20 more times, and stood. He was unhurried. He was composed. He was dressed neatly, as always, with his sleeves already pressed for the evening. And when he met her eyes, there was no shadow of dread in his expression, no rehearsed reassurance, no performance of calm to cover something roiling beneath. Just stillness. The same stillness that had confused and unsettled people since the day he arrived. He thinks this is a trap, she said quietly. He's right, said Fenris simply. It is. He began walking toward their corridor. Aren't you afraid? She asked. He considered the question with what appeared to be genuine reflection. No, he said. She stared at his back as he walked straight-shouldered, unhurried, not a single thing about him suggesting a man preparing for his own public destruction. Behind her, Cole was already practicing the knot again, whispering the steps to himself. Left over right, underneath and through. Down the hall, Fenris had begun, almost inaudibly, to hum. And that the humming, the straightness of his spine, the complete and total absence of fear, in a man who had every reason to feel it was the most unsettling thing Vanya had witnessed in 3 years of knowing him. Not because it was strange, because it was beginning to feel, deeply and disturbingly, like a man who already knew how the story ended. Chapter 4. Memory is a strange instrument. It does not always show you what matters in the moment it happens. Sometimes it waits, stores something quietly in a back corridor of the mind, unremarked and unexamined, and only retrieves it later, when a new piece of information arrives and suddenly everything rearranges itself around a truth that was present all along. The pack would do a great deal of that rearranging in the days to come. They would sit with their memories and turn them over slowly, like stones pulled from a riverbed, examining what had always been on the underside. And they would ask themselves, one by one, in the privacy of their own discomfort, how did we not see it? The answer, of course, was simple. They had not been looking. The first thing was Aldrich. He was a mid-ranking warrior, broad, dependable, not given to imagination, who had contracted a lung sickness the previous winter that the pack healer had classified, with characteristic bluntness, as terminal in the advanced stage. The healer had said it with the practiced detachment of someone delivering weather reports. The infection had reached both lungs. The fever had held for 11 days. And at that progression, the body simply ran out of options. Aldrich's mate had been informed. Arrangements had been quietly discussed. By the 14th morning, Aldrich was sitting up in bed requesting food. By the 21st, he was back on patrol. The pack healer visited twice more, studied his breathing, pressed hands to his chest, and said nothing useful on either occasion. His notes recorded the recovery as anomalous. He filed them without further investigation, because there was always something else requiring attention, and anomalies, in his experience, rarely demanded explanation if you waited long enough. Nobody connected it to Fenris. Nobody had seen Fenris visit. Nobody had thought to ask who left the small cloth parcels of herbs outside Aldrich's door every third evening for a month, parcels tied in a particular way, with a particular combination of plants that no healer in the pack's memory had ever assembled together. Aldrich himself, when asked later, would remember only that the herbs smelled like deep forest and winter stone. He would not remember thanking anyone. There had been no one there to thank. The second thing was the rogue. It happened near the northern border on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon in early autumn. A patrol unit had tracked an unfamiliar scent to the boundary line, fresh, unregistered, the particular edge of a wolf who answers to nothing and no one. Rogues at Ironblood borders were not unusual. Rogues who lingered were. This one had been stationary for nearly an hour, just inside the tree line. By the time the patrol reached the boundary, Fenris was already there. He had no business being there. His range did not extend to the northern border. He had never explained his presence, and, in the general confusion of what followed, no one thought to ask. What the patrol unit witnessed, all four of them, separately corroborated, was this. The rogue emerged from the trees. It was larger than most Ironblood warriors, gray-pelted, with the particular energy of a wolf accustomed to surviving entirely alone. Its eyes found Fenris across the 30 feet of open ground between them, and stayed there. A long moment passed. Then the rogue lowered its head. Not the automatic deference of a wolf encountering a dominant stranger, not a submission born of fear. Something more deliberate than either a slow, almost formal inclination, held for several seconds, before the animal turned and moved back into the forest without sound. It did not look back. The patrol unit stood in silence for a moment. Did that just... One of them started. "Rogues don't bow," said another, with the firm conviction of someone trying to replace what they had just witnessed with something sensible. They filed the incident as border contact, no engagement required, and returned to the compound. Fenris had already left by then. Nobody asked him what had passed between them in that open ground. Nobody could articulate, precisely, why they didn't. The third thing was the hound. Elder Sierra found it late on a Wednesday evening, one of the old hunting dogs, gray-muzzled and hip-failing, lying near the woodpile behind the eastern quarters. It had stopped eating 3 days prior. Its breathing was the particular shallow kind that signals a body in the process of concluding itself. Sierra had knelt beside it, intending to sit with it through what remained. Instead, she found she was not alone. Fenris was already there, cross-legged in the dirt, speaking to the animal in a low voice she couldn't fully hear from where she stood. His hand rested lightly along the hound's side. He was not performing comfort, he was simply present. In the specific way he was always present, as though being there fully was itself a kind of medicine. Sierra watched from the corner of the building. She watched the hound's sides, which had been moving in quick, effortful intervals, begin to slow into something steadier, deeper. The animal's head, which had been raised in the taut way of a creature fighting its own body, settled gradually to the ground. Not in surrender. In rest. Genuine rest. Fenris sat with it for another hour. He did not notice Sierra. When he finally stood and walked back toward the main compound, the hound was breathing with a rhythm it had not managed in days. It lived another 4 months. Sierra told no one what she had seen. But something changed behind her eyes, something shifted in the careful, archival mind of a woman who had spent 60 years cataloging pack history, and she began, very quietly, to look at things differently. And then there was the garden. This was the one the pack acknowledged, briefly, in the way people acknowledge things they cannot comfortably hold, with a short remark and a quick change of subject. It was midwinter, hard frost, ground like iron, the kind of cold that killed everything that was not built specifically for it. Fenris's garden grew. Not struggling, not persisting against odds in the valiant way of something refusing to die. Simply growing. Green and ordered and lush, as though the temperature were merely a suggestion it had declined to follow. Warriors passing the eastern wall would glance at it sideways and keep walking. Someone joked that he must be using something in the soil. Nobody investigated what that something might be. Nobody wanted to look directly at it long enough to form a question they couldn't answer. This is the nature of the inexplicable, when it lives in close proximity. The mind learns to smooth it over, to file it in the drawer marked coincidence or unusual but manageable, and to shut the drawer firmly before anything else climbs out. What the Ironblood pack did not understand, what they could not have understood, because understanding it would have required them to question everything they thought they knew about power, was that these were not mysteries. They were evidence. Each small, quiet, impossible thing was a data point in a portrait that had been assembling itself for years, right in front of them, in plain sight. Something ancient was living in their compound, tending their garden, healing their sick, walking their borders. And it had been patient boundlessly, almost incomprehensibly patient, in ways that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with a choice that none of them were yet equipped to understand. The full moon was 4 days away. The portrait was almost complete, Chapter 5. There is a particular discomfort that arrives not with a crash but with a drip. Slow, persistent, accumulating in the quiet spaces between one thought and the next, in the pause before sleep, in the middle of conversations that have nothing to do with it. It is the discomfort of a mind that has accepted something it is no longer entirely certain is true, and doesn't yet know what to replace it with. It had been spreading through the Ironblood compound for days. Nobody named it. Naming it would have required admitting it existed. But it was there in the way certain wolves went slightly quiet when Fenris passed through a room, in the way eyes that used to slide past him now snagged, briefly, before looking away. Something had shifted in the compound's atmosphere, subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm, and the wolves who were most attuned to their instincts felt it in their chests, without being able to say what it was. Elder Sira could say exactly what it was. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to begin. She found Vanya at the Eastern training yard on the second morning after the banquet announcement, running drills alone, with the focused aggression of someone working something out of their system that exercise wasn't quite reaching. Sira did not announce herself. She lowered herself onto the stone bench at the yard's edge and waited until Vanya noticed her and stopped. Elder Sira. Vanya crossed the yard, breathing measured despite the exertion. If you're here about the banquet format challenge, I already know there's no time to. I'm not here about the banquet, Sira said. Something in her tone caused Vanya to go still. Sira's hands were folded in her lap. Her expression was the particular kind of neutral that takes decades to perfect, not empty, but contained, holding more than it showed. She looked at Vanya for a moment with those careful archival eyes. Then she asked her question. Where did you meet your husband? The simplicity of it was almost disarming. Vanya blinked. We've spoken about Fenris before. You know how. Humor me, said Sira quietly. Precisely. Where? A brief pause. Near the old territories, Northeast Ridge. Vanya reached for her water, took a slow drink. I was running a solo trail assessment before my tracker certification. I found him traveling alone. No pack scent, no markings, just moving through the old forest like he'd walked it 1,000 times. She paused, near the ruins. The old Lycan ruins at the base of the ridge. Silence. Vanya lowered the water. Sira had gone pale. Not the pale of shock, something slower than that. The pale of a person watching a long-held theory confirm itself in real time, of pieces arranging into a picture that is both exactly what they suspected and somehow still more than they were prepared for. Elder Sira. Vanya's voice dropped. What do you know? Sira was quiet for what felt like a very long time. A wolf called across the compound somewhere behind them. The morning light shifted through the training yard's eastern gap. Enough, said Sira finally. To be very careful about what I say before I'm certain. She rose from the bench with the deliberate steadiness of someone choosing each movement intentionally, adjusted her shawl, looked at Vanya with an expression that contained, beneath all its control, the faintest trace of something that might have been awe. Watch him, she said. Not to protect him. Just watch. And whatever happens at the banquet, do not act before he does. She left before Vanya could form another question. Across the compound, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. His name was Davin, 22 years old, third-year warrior, one of the group who had been present in the courtyard when the herb basket was kicked over. He had not been the one to kick it. He had been the one who laughed. It was a distinction that had been troubling him with increasing persistence for the past 4 days. He could not locate the source of the feeling exactly. It wasn't guilt in any form he recognized. Guilt, in Ironblood culture, was a private weakness you buried quickly and never mentioned. This was something different. Something that felt less like an internal judgment and more like an external pressure, like a hand resting with quiet authority on the back of his neck, reminding him of something he hadn't yet acknowledged. He found Fenris in the drying room off the eastern corridor, rehanging bundles that had come loose from their ceiling hooks. The room smelled powerfully of yarrow and something darker, almost mineral. Fenris looked up when Davin appeared in the doorway and waited without expression. Davin cleared his throat. The courtyard, he started, then stopped, restarted. The herbs, last week. I wasn't the one who... He exhaled. I laughed. I shouldn't have laughed. He had rehearsed more than that. It left him anyway. Fenris regarded him for a moment. Not weighing the apology, there was no visible calculation in his expression. He simply looked at Davin the way he looked at most things, directly, Without performance, without the social machinery most people kept running in their eyes. "I know," he said, simply. "Then, you're forgiven." No qualification. No extracted promise to do better. No leveraged discomfort held just long enough to make a point. Just release. Immediate and complete. As though it cost him nothing because it genuinely didn't. Davin nodded. Moved to leave. Stopped when Fenris spoke again. "The pull along your left shoulder blade," Fenris said, turning back to the hanging bundles. "The one you've had since the hunt. Comfrey and pine resin, I'll leave it at your door tonight. Apply it warm." Davin turned around slowly. "I didn't tell anyone about that." Fenris selected a hook, looped the bundle, tested its hold. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He offered nothing further. Davin stood in the doorway of the drawing room for a long moment, the smell of herbs pressing around him, something moving through his chest that he had no name for yet. He left without another word. He did not tell anyone what had happened. But that night, sitting in the warriors' hall, he found himself watching Fenris cross the far end of the room with entirely different eyes, and he noticed, with a start, that he was not the only one. Across the table, another warrior was watching too. Neither of them spoke about it. Merrick noticed. This was the thing about Merrick, whatever his failures of wisdom, his failures of perception were few. He could read a room the way a hunter reads terrain. And what he was reading now was a shift he did not like. The laughter had changed quality. The easy contempt that had always surrounded Fenris's presence in the compound, that frictionless, reflexive dismissal, had developed a hesitation. Small, almost imperceptible. Almost. He called his inner circle together that evening and delivered a single change to the banquet arrangements. "Move it forward," he said. 2 days. Bran looked up. "The preparations aren't." 2 days, Merrick repeated, with the particular flatness that ended conversations. He had spent 15 years understanding one thing above all others. Control is not something you maintain through strength alone. It is something you maintain through timing. And timing, right now, was slipping. He could feel it. The way you feel ice thinning beneath your feet, not yet breaking, but no longer entirely certain. He did not know what was changing. He knew only that it needed to be stopped before it finished changing. He was already too late. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 6. She left before dawn. No announcement. No escort. Elder Sira had spent 60 years earning the right to move through Ironblood territory without explanation, and she exercised that right quietly, pulling her shawl against the pre-morning cold and taking the northeastern trail while the compound still slept. She had been putting this off for 3 days. She could not put it off any longer. The ruins were not on any current pack map. This was intentional, not an oversight, but a deliberate erasure, performed generations ago by alphas who had decided, with the particular arrogance of the newly powerful, that history predating their own lineage was history not worth preserving. The structures existed in the oldest written records Sira had access to, referenced in language so formal it felt almost ceremonial. The first place. The origin stones. The house of the first king. Most wolves born in the last 2 generations didn't know they existed. Sira had known since she was 19, had visited twice in her life, once out of scholarly curiosity, once because a dying elder had pressed her hand and said someone must remember where they are. She had been the someone. She had remembered. The trail took 40 minutes on foot. The forest changed quality as she walked older, denser. The trees broader at the base and spaced with a particular deliberateness that felt less like nature and more like intention. Like something had grown here with a plan. The undergrowth thinned. The birdsong quieted. The air held a mineral coolness that had nothing to do with temperature. And then the ruins appeared through the tree line like a held breath finally released. They were not dramatic, as ancient things sometimes are. No towering columns. No grand archways reaching for absent skies. Just stone dark, dense, fitted together with a precision that required no mortar and had required no repairs across what the records suggested was several thousand years. Low walls. A wide central platform, cracked through the middle by a root system that had taken centuries to accomplish its slow splitting. Carvings on every surface, not decorative, not symbolic in the abstract way of things meant to impress. Specific, deliberate, documentary. Sira moved through the outer ring slowly, her hand trailing the carved surfaces, reading what she had partially read twice before, histories of packs long dissolved. records of territories long reclaimed by forest, names in an older script that she could only partially translate, but that her bones seemed to understand in a register below language. She was not here for the outer ring. She moved to the central platform, to the inner wall, and stopped. She had seen this carving before. She had stood in this exact position, in this exact light, gray and directionless, filtered through old canopy, and looked at this exact face, carved into this exact stone, and she had thought, remarkable workmanship, extraordinarily preserved. Whoever this depicts was someone the old world considered worth remembering. She had not, on either previous visit, recognized the face. She recognized it now. The figure was tall, rendered in profile first, then full face in the larger central panel, with the particular confidence of an artist who knew their subject intimately, calm-featured, strong jaw, eyes that the carver had somehow managed to imbue, in stone, with a quality of depth that had no business existing in an inanimate medium. A man who looked like he was listening to something just beyond the frame. A man who looked like he had nowhere to be, and all the time that had ever existed to get there. Around him, in every direction the panel extended, wolves were bowing. Not the wolves of any single pack. Wolves of every configuration, large and small, dark and pale, the ancient variants that no longer existed in their pure form, and the ancestors of every lineage currently living, all of them with heads lowered, all of them oriented toward the still, quiet figure at the center, who was not performing authority. Who simply was it? Sierra's hand found the wall beside her. Held it. Beneath the central panel, in the oldest script, the one she could only partially read, an inscription ran the full width of the stone. She had translated fragments of it on her second visit, years ago, and written them in a private journal she had not opened since. She did not need the journal now. The words came without effort, because some things, once truly understood, do not require remembering. They simply remain. He who wears stillness like armor shall return when the pack has forgotten what it serves. The forest held its silence around her. Sierra stood before the face of the first Lycan King, carved in stone by hands that had been dust for 3,000 years, and understood, with a completeness that moved through her entire body at once, that he had been eating dinner in the Ironblood compound last night, that he had been kneeling in its courtyard mud 2 weeks ago, washing herbs with a patience so vast it had no bottom, that he had been here, in this pack, under this sky, choosing, every single day, not to be what he was. She did not know why. She knew only that the inscription told her the condition of his return, and the condition had been met long ago, and that something was now in motion that no banquet, no alpha, and no pack law had the faintest power to stop. She pressed her palm flat against the carved face. It was warm. Stone that had sat in a cold forest, through an autumn dawn warm, as though something lived just beneath its surface. As though it recognized, in some way that predated logic, that the distance between itself and its subject had finally closed. Sierra removed her hand, steadied her breathing, turned and walked back through the ruins toward the tree line. She had one more thing to do before the banquet. She found Vanya in the main corridor of the central building, moving between tasks, with the clipped efficiency of someone running on too little sleep and too much unspent anxiety. Sierra fell into step beside her without preamble, matching her pace. "Tonight," Sierra said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Vanya slowed. Read Sierra's expression. Stopped entirely. In 30 years of knowing Elder Sierra, Vanya had never seen her look like this. Not frightened, Sierra did not do frightened, but awed. Shaken loose from her own certainty in a way that looked almost foreign on her face, like a fault line appearing in bedrock. "What did you find?" Vanya asked. Sierra was quiet for a moment, choosing, with characteristic precision, exactly how much to say. "Something that changes the shape of everything," she said finally. "Something that has been true since long before any of us were born." She held Vanya's gaze. "Protect him tonight. Not from the pack's judgment, he does not need that protection. Protect yourself. Your instincts will tell you to intervene, and you must not." A pause. A pause. "Whatever happens at the banquet, do not let your fear make you act before he does. Do you understand?" Vanya stared at her. "Sierra, what are you? Do you understand?" A long beat. "Yes," Vanya said, quietly, with the weight of someone who doesn't fully understand but trusts the gravity of what they're being asked. Sira nodded once. Down the hall, perhaps 40 feet away, separated by a corner and 2 closed doors, Fenris was in the drying room, recataloguing his stores for the evening. He looked up. Not toward the door, not toward any sound. Directly toward the wall that separated him from where Vanya and Sira were standing, with those deep, still, storm-colored eyes. As though he had heard every word from a distance that should have made it impossible. A slow breath. A return to the herbs in his hands. The ghost of something moved across his face, not surprise, not urgency, just the quiet, private expression of a man noting that the clock, at last, had begun. Down the corridor, Sira pulled her shawl close and walked away without looking back. The banquet was hours away. The ruins remembered what the pack had forgotten. And the king had always known exactly when the time would come. Chapter 7. The hall had never looked more deliberate. Every torch mounted. Every banner straightened. The long ceremonial tables arranged with a precision that spoke less of celebration and more of theater, the careful staging of a man who understood that humiliation, to be truly effective, requires an audience and adequate lighting. Marek had thought of everything. The senior warriors occupied the head tables. Ranking mates sat beside them, dressed formally, performing the composed pride expected of their position. Younger wolves filled the outer rows, absorbing the ritual of it, learning, as pack gatherings were designed to teach them, what belonging looked like and what it cost. Elder Sira sat at the far end of the elders' table, with her hands folded and her eyes moving. Vanya sat in her assigned place, senior tracker, third table, left side in a green ceremonial tunic she had pressed that morning with hands that wouldn't quite steady. She had not touched her food. She had barely touched her water. Every nerve in her body was a drawn string, and she was spending enormous energy ensuring that none of it showed on her face. Fenris was not seated. It had begun subtly, as Marek's constructions always did. During the opening formalities, as mates were called to stand and be acknowledged by the pack, a ceremony that in previous years had been brief and dignified, Marek had paused after Vanya's name and looked across the hall with theatrical consideration. "Fenris," he said, "since you've made such a home in our compound, perhaps you'd be comfortable making yourself useful for the evening. The serving table needs managing." A few warriors had exchanged glances. Most had kept their expressions carefully forward. Fenris had looked at Marek across the length of the hall. A long, level look that contained no particular emotion, just attention, clean and complete. Then he had walked to the serving table and begun. He did it without visible resentment and without visible humiliation, which immediately unsettled the people watching for both. He poured water into goblets with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything. When a plate needed carrying, he carried it. When a warrior's cup ran low, he refilled it without being summoned. The pack watched, some with entertainment, more, as the evening progressed, with a discomfort they couldn't locate the edges of. Because Fenris moved through the hall the way he moved through every space, like a man entirely at home in his own body, entirely unburdened by the opinion of his surroundings. He did not shuffle. He did not shrink. He carried plates with the bearing of someone who had chosen this, which was the one quality Marek had not accounted for and could not override. Dignity, it turned out, did not require permission. Vanya watched him cross the hall for the third time and felt something building in her chest with nowhere to go. Fury and admiration and grief all pressing against the same walls simultaneously. Sira at the far table did not look at Vanya. She watched the hearth. It was the meat that broke the architecture of the evening. Marek reached for something at the edge of his plate deliberately, unhurriedly, with the relaxed confidence of a man in complete control of his environment, and let it fall. A cut of elk, landing on the stone floor with a flat sound that somehow carried across the entire hall. The conversation in the room dimmed by several degrees. People felt it without knowing why, some animal awareness that the temperature of the moment had changed. Marek looked down at the meat, then up at Fenris, who had stopped 3 tables away. "Pick that up," Marek said pleasantly. Fenris was still. "On your knees," Marek added. "For the room, for the record, for the pack law provision he was constructing in real time and needed witnessed. A proper servant fetches from the floor." The hall went fully silent. Not the comfortable silence of a pause between conversations. The pressurized silence of a room in which every person has simultaneously understood that something is happening that cannot be taken back. Younger wolves looked at the floor. Senior warriors looked at Marek. A few looked at Fenris with expressions that had traveled, over the course of the evening, a considerable distance from where they had started. Vanya stood up. She did it before the thought completed itself, pure reflex, the body acting on something deeper than decision. Her chair scraped back. Her hands were flat on the table. Every eye in the room moved to her. Marek turned his head toward her with the slow satisfaction of a man watching a trap close. "Careful, Vanya," he said. The pleasantness was still in his voice, but its function had changed. It was a surface now, covering something with teeth. A mate who publicly contests a formal assessment invokes the bond's validity clause. You know the law. A pause precisely long enough. Sit down, or I dissolve it by pack right. Tonight, in front of everyone. The room held its breath. Vanya's hands pressed harder against the table. Her jaw was locked. Every muscle in her body was in direct conflict with every other muscle, and the war of it was visible in the rigid line of her shoulders, the white at her knuckles, the way her eyes burned with something that had no clean outlet. She looked at Fenris. He was already looking at her. And the expression on his face, the one she had never seen in 3 years of knowing every version of him, stopped her completely. Not anger. She knew his anger, rare and quiet as it was. Not fear. Fenris did not produce fear in any form she had learned to recognize. This was something with no name in the modern vocabulary of wolves. Something that belonged to a register older than language, older than pack law, older than the concept of alphas and hierarchies and ceremonial banquets staged for the execution of personal vendettas. It was the expression of something that has been waiting, that has always known it would eventually stop waiting. That is, at last, done. He held her gaze for one more second, steady, certain, carrying in that steadiness everything she had ever needed to hear, and then he looked away. He set the plate down on the nearest table. Slowly, without sound, he straightened to his full height. And the hearth fire turned silver. It did not gutter or flare. It simply changed. The orange warmth of it draining away and replacing itself with a light that had no color. Anyone in the room had a word for silver at its surface. But beneath that, something older. Something that pressed against the backs of eyes like a frequency slightly beyond hearing. Every candle in the hall followed. The temperature dropped, not gradually, the way cold arrives through an open door, but all at once, as though the warmth of the room had been recalled by something with the authority to recall it. Breath became visible. The warriors nearest the walls shifted without knowing they were shifting, bodies responding to something their minds had not yet processed. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of people waiting. It was the silence of people who had suddenly, viscerally, understood that they were in the presence of something they had no framework for. Marek rose from his chair. His face had not changed, still controlled, still arranged around the structure of authority he wore the way other men wore armor, but something was moving behind his eyes that had not been there a moment before. Something with no name that he would have refused to name even if he had it. He crossed the 3 tables' distance in 4 strides, drew back his arm, and swung at Fenris with the full, practiced force of a wolf who had never once thrown a punch that didn't land. His arm stopped. Mid-arc, completely. As though it had met a wall, not a physical surface, but a presence. A resistance that had no material form and absolute material effect. His fist hung in the air 8 inches from Fenris's face, trembling with the effort of a body trying to complete an action that something had simply declined to permit. Marek's face, for the first time in 15 years of witnessed leadership, showed something that was not calculation. Then the sound arrived. Not from any direction. From everywhere simultaneously, or perhaps from inside the bones of everyone present, resonating outward from the marrow, the way sound moves through stone rather than air. It was not a roar. It was not a voice. It was a frequency, a register that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the ancient, wordless part of every wolf that existed before culture, before hierarchy, before any of them had learned to build halls and hold banquets and construct laws to use against each other. It said one thing, without words. Enough. Marek's wolf, the beast that had faced down 24 challengers, that had never flinched, that had never bent, made a sound in the back of his throat. Small, involuntary, helpless. A whimper. In front of his entire pack. The hall was not silent anymore. It was something beyond silence, the condition that exists on the other side of it, when every person present has stopped breathing at exactly the same moment, and the room itself seems to be holding what they cannot. Fenris had not moved. He stood in the silver light of a hearth that should not have been silver, in the cold of a room that should not have been cold, and he looked at Merrick with those deep, storm-still eyes. Not with anger, not with triumph, with the particular expression of a man arriving at the end of a very long patience, and beginning, at last, to speak. Chapter 8. He spoke quietly. This was the first thing the pack would remember afterward, not the silver fire, not the doors, not the massive ancient shapes that filled the hall's threshold. Those things were spectacular, and spectacle fades with retelling. What stayed, what embedded itself in the memory of every wolf present with the permanence of something carved rather than learned, was the quietness of his voice. He did not raise it. He did not need to. I have been patient. 3 words, and the room was already different, already rearranging itself around what was being said, the way a landscape rearranges itself around the arrival of weather. His voice moved at a frequency that had nothing to do with volume. It moved through the air, and then through what was beneath the air, through the walls and the floor and the dense, specific matter of every person present, felt in sternum and spine and the oldest parts of the skull. Not painful, not violent, simply undeniable. Patient, he continued, because patience is a kindness I chose to give, not a weakness you were right to assume. Marek's arm was still raised, still suspended in that invisible restraint, trembling now with the effort of a body that had never been told no and did not know how to process it. His face was a war control, fighting something that control had no tools for, ego pressing against an instinct that was older and smarter than either. Fenris looked at him without cruelty and without particular interest. Then he looked at the room. What the room looked back at him with was something that had been traveling toward this moment for weeks without knowing its destination. The warriors who had laughed in the courtyard. The wolves who had exchanged contemptuous glances over his quiet work. The younger wolves who had absorbed, from their elders and their alpha, the lesson that a man like Fenris was a lesson in what not to be. They looked at him now with the specific, disorienting experience of people whose lesson has just been inverted. The silver fire breathed in the hearth behind him, casting his shadow long and precise across the stone floor. The cold in the room had not lifted, it had settled, established itself as a new baseline, as though the temperature had been corrected rather than altered. Vanya had not moved. She was standing at her table with her hands still flat against its surface, and her eyes fixed on Fenris with an expression that was not quite any single thing, not shock, because some part of her had been moving toward this understanding for days, something more complex. The feeling of watching the final piece of a vast architecture fall into place and realizing the entire structure had been visible all along, if you had known where to look. Sira, at the far table, had closed her eyes. Not from fear. From something that looked, quietly, like relief. The doors opened. Both of them, simultaneously, with no visible hand upon them, swinging wide with a sound like an exhale, like something that had been holding its breath finally permitted to release it. The cold that entered was different from the cold already in the room. It carried in it the mineral darkness of deep forest, the particular ancient quality of air that has moved through trees older than memory, and beneath that faint but absolute something that had no name in the current vocabulary of wolves. They came in silence. There were 7 of them. Massive, larger than any wolf currently living, larger than the ancestral variants recorded in the oldest pack histories. Silver-furred, every one, with a silver so dense it seemed to generate its own light rather than reflect the halls. They moved without sound, not because they were being careful, but because they were things that had existed long enough to have shed the need for sound entirely. Their paws on the stone floor of the banquet hall left no mark. They entered in a line and arranged themselves along the hall's length, 4 on one side, 3 on the other, and then, as one, without signal, without hesitation, they lowered their heads. Not to the hall, not to the room, to the man standing at its center in a pressed shirt with mud-calloused hands and storm-deep eyes. To Fenris. The sound that moved through the assembled pack in response to this was not a sound any of them made deliberately. It was the sound of collective instinct overriding collective pretension, a sharp, involuntary intake, the body's honest response to something the mind was still several seconds behind on. The warriors were frozen. Not by any external force, nothing held them. They were frozen the way prey is frozen, the way any creature is frozen when something registers in the primitive architecture of their nervous system as being so far above them in the order of things that the concept of response becomes temporarily unavailable. Merrick shifted. Or tried to. It happened in the space between 1 second and the next, the familiar gathering of self that preceded the change, the reaching inward for the wolf that had always, without exception, answered. He had shifted under injury. He had shifted under grief. He had shifted in circumstances that had broken other wolves entirely, and his beast had come without hesitation every single time. It did not come now. The reaching found nothing. Not resistance, nothing so definable as resistance, simply absence. As though the wolf had looked at what was standing in the center of that silver-lit hall and made, with the quiet wisdom of instinct unclouded by ego, an entirely rational decision. Not this. Not here. Not him. Merrick's hands hit the table in front of him, both of them, flat, holding himself up with the arms of a man whose legs have become uncertain. His breath came audibly. The pack saw it. Every wolf in the room saw their alpha's hands shaking against the ceremonial tablecloth, and the world that those wolves had organized themselves inside shifted on its foundation in a way that nothing would ever fully shift back. Fenris watched him without expression. Then, with the measured deliberateness of a man who has all the time that has ever existed and intends to use exactly as much of it as he chooses, he turned to the room. Not to Merrick specifically, to all of them. The warriors and their mates, the younger wolves at the outer tables, the elders who had gone still as standing water, the ancient silver guardians lining the hall like pillars of something older than architecture. He looked at the room the way the carving in the ruins looked out from its stone fully, directly, with the particular quality of vision that sees everything it turns toward and finds none of it surprising. He said, "You have my name wrong." A pause, unhurried. The silence in the room was total. "And it is time I gave it back to you properly." What happened in the next moment was not dramatic in any way the pack had been taught to recognize as dramatic. There was no explosion of power, no transformation in the theatrical sense, no roar designed to demonstrate magnitude. He simply became visible. That is the only way any witness would ever find to describe it afterward, in the halting, insufficient language available to people trying to articulate something that had occurred at a level below language. He had been present before. He had been in this room, in this compound, in this territory for years. But the thing standing in the silver light of the banquet hall now was not concealed. It was not performing calm, it was calm, in the way that a mountain does not perform stillness. It was not borrowing patience, it was patience, in the way that deep water does not borrow depth. The authority in the room did not announce itself. It had always been there. They had simply, finally, been allowed to see it. Elder Sira opened her eyes. Vanya made a sound one, small, involuntary, that was not quite any emotion she had a name for, and pressed her fingers to her mouth. And the 7 ancient guardians, silver and vast and older than every story the pack had ever told itself, held their heads low before the king they had always known would return. The king who had been kneeling in courtyard mud 3 weeks ago, washing herbs with careful hands, humming something wordless to himself, waiting. Not because he had to. Because he had chosen to give them the chance to be better. They had used the chance poorly. Now the accounting would begin. Chapter 9. Nobody moved. Not from compulsion, nothing in the room demanded stillness by force. They were still because stillness was the only honest response available to people standing at the edge of something they did not have a map for. The ancient guardians lined the hall like silver monuments. The fire breathed its impossible color. The cold had settled into permanence, and in that cold, every wolf present was discovering something uncomfortable about the architecture of their own instincts. They had always believed that power announced itself through noise. What was standing in front of them had never made noise about itself once. Fenris looked at the room for a long moment, not scanning it, not assessing it, simply seeing it, with the full, patient attention he gave to everything. Then he pulled the nearest chair from the closest table and sat down. The simplicity of it was almost violent in context. He sat the way he sat at their own table at home, unhurried, collected, one arm resting across his knee, as though the silver fire and the ancient guardians and the trembling alpha 3 tables away were simply the current conditions of the room, and the current conditions of rooms had never particularly disturbed him. "I want to tell you a story," he said quietly, "about yourselves." He began with the wolves nobody remembered. Kaspar, a mid-ranking wolf dismissed from the pack 4 years prior for refusing to participate in a border raid he believed was unjust. Merrick had called it weakness. Had stripped his rank in public and sent him east with nothing. Kaspar had a mate and 2 pups at the time. The pack had watched it happen and said nothing, because saying something cost more than silence, and silence was the compound's most practiced currency. There was no anger in Fenris's voice as he said the name, just precision. The deliberate, careful weight of a man ensuring that Caspar's name was said clearly, in a full room, by someone with the authority to make it permanent. Then he said another name, then another. Each one landed in the silence like a stone into still water, clean, specific, sending rings outward that touched every surface in the room. Wolves cast out, wolves silenced. Mates threatened with bond dissolution for the crime of defending something Merrick found inconvenient. Elders removed from council seats because their wisdom contradicted his direction. The pack listened. And the pack, which had individually known fragments of each story, which had stored each fragment in that interior drawer, marked not my business, not my place, not the right time, heard them assembled together for the first time, heard the full shape of what they had collectively permitted, heard their own silence played back to them as the instrument it had actually been. The shame was not imposed from outside. It rose from inside, the way things rise when they have been buried too long and ground too shallow. It moved through the room like the cold establishing itself as a new baseline, replacing something that could not, now, be restored. Younger wolves were looking at the floor. Senior warriors had gone very still in the particular way of people whose self-image is undergoing rapid, unwelcome revision. One of Merrick's inner circle, Bran, broad-shouldered, never uncertain of anything, had his jaw working against something he could neither swallow nor release. Merrick himself stood at his table with both hands still flat against it. His face had reorganized itself into a mask so tight it was almost sculptural, the last effort expression of a man holding his own construction together through pure, desperate will. Fenris looked at him. "And then there are the children," he said. This was the one that broke the room's remaining composure. Not the adults. The pack could absorb the adult stories, they could file them, contextualize them, locate the points at which they might have intervened and build a private case for why they hadn't. Adults made choices. Adults had agency. Adults, in the brutal mathematics of pack culture, were expected to defend themselves or accept the consequences of their inability to do so. But Fenris spoke of the children without performance and without mercy. The pups who had sickened in the winters when Merrick had banned formal healing practice from the compound on the grounds that wolves who couldn't fight their own illness were wolves not worth the pack's resources. The ones who had survived because Fenris had moved through the compound in the dark, leaving medicines at doors that nobody ever traced back to their origin. The ones who had not survived, whose names Fenris said with the same clean, careful weight as all the others. He said their names. Every one of them. And the sound that moved through the room at that, not one sound but many, overlapping, involuntary, emerging from the parents of those children, from the warriors who had watched and done nothing, from wolves who had not allowed themselves to connect the policy to the consequences, until this moment made connection unavoidable, was the most devastating sound the hall had ever held. Marek's mask cracked. Not all the way. But along one line, visible, irreparable. "You have no authority here," he said. His voice was controlled, but it cost him. "Whatever you are, whatever this is, you have no right to." "I have every right," Fenris said simply. "I am the origin of the right. Yours came from mine, 12 generations back. What you built with it is what you're looking at now." He stood. The room changed again when he stood, a further shift, as though his full height carried information his seated form had only implied. The ancient guardians lifted their heads slightly, attending. Fenris walked toward Merrick. Unhurried, no performance of menace. He had never needed menace and did not reach for it now. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at the Alpha with an expression that was entirely, precisely what it appeared to be. The complete and final assessment of a thing that has been thoroughly examined and found to have no further secrets. "Do you know what the severing is?" Fenris asked. Marek said nothing. The question had taken him somewhere between defiance and something he had no language for yet. "Your historians lost it 3 centuries ago, along with most of what they should have remembered." He held Merrick's gaze. "It is not a punishment in the way you would understand punishment. It is a correction, a return to accurate proportion." He raised one hand. Not dramatically, the way you raise a hand to close a door that should have been closed some time ago. What came from it had no visual form. No light, no visible energy, no cinematic display of power for the room to narrate afterward. It was absence rather than presence, a removal, surgical and absolute, of the thread that connected Marek's human self to the wolf that had given him every advantage he had ever converted into cruelty. Marek felt it leave. The sound he made was not a roar and not a scream. It was something beneath both, the sound of a man discovering, in real time, that the thing he had organized his entire identity around is no longer there. That the place where it lived is simply empty, like pressing your tongue to a tooth that has always been present and finding only the gap where it was. He fell. Not violently, his legs gave with the quiet finality of things that have lost their reason to hold. He went down to the stone floor of his own banquet hall and stayed there, both hands pressed to the ground, breathing in the shallow, searching way of someone trying to locate something they will not find. Fully human, fully powerless. Stripped, at last, to the only thing he had always actually been, underneath every advantage he had been given and never earned. The room held its silence. Fenris looked down at him without triumph, without contempt, with something that might, from a certain angle, have resembled sorrow not for what had just occurred, but for the long accumulation of choices that had made it necessary. "You valued strength above all else," he said quietly. Marek was breathing against the floor. His hands were shaking. "Now you shall live without any." A paused the length of something meant. "So you may finally learn the value of a soul." Vanya had not moved from her position beside the table. She was watching Fenris, had been watching him since the moment his arm settled back to his side with an expression that was still completing itself, still assembling from its component parts into something she could hold. What arrived, finally, was not what she expected. Not awe, though awe was present. Not relief, though that was there too, pressing warm against the back of her throat. What arrived was understanding. She thought of every night he had held her while she cried, every morning he had risen early to tend things that needed tending, every moment of mockery he had absorbed without fracture, every cruelty he had declined to repay, every deliberate, conscious choice to remain gentle in the face of a world that interpreted gentleness as an absence of power. He had not been hiding because he was afraid. He had been hiding because he believed, with the deep, patient, ancient certainty of someone who has watched civilizations make this mistake before, that people given the chance to find their own decency will sometimes take it. He had given them the chance. He had given them years of it, and they had spent every day of those years proving they were not yet ready to receive what he was offering. The grief of that, not her grief, his, the grief of a king who had wanted so much more for them, settled across her chest with a weight she had no framework for. She looked at his face. He looked back at her across the silver-lit, silent, permanently altered room. And what she saw there was not victory. It was the expression of a man who had hoped for a different ending, loved these people enough to try for it, and was now, with characteristic quietness, accepting the one that had actually arrived. The guardians held their vigil. The fire burned silver. And on the floor of a banquet hall that would never again be used for cruelty, the most powerful wolf who had ever lived knelt briefly beside the man he had unmade, not in mercy, not in performance, and placed one steady hand on Marek's shoulder. Not comfort, exactly. Acknowledgement. The recognition of a soul that had always been present beneath the damage, however deeply buried. The insistence, even now, on treating it as worth addressing. Fenris stood, turned to the room that was his, and began the quieter, harder, more necessary work of what came next. Chapter 10. Change does not arrive like lightning. It arrives like dawn, gradual, quiet, and only fully visible once it has already happened. 3 weeks after the banquet, the compound wore its transformation, in small, unheroic ways. Raised garden beds lined the eastern courtyard wall, built without instruction by warriors who had decided, independently and without announcement, that this was something they owed. The healing quarters had doubled in size. The war room now held a round table with 7 seats, each one equal in height to every other. Nobody had needed to be told what these things meant. That was the point. Bran was learning to make bread. He burned the first batch, underprepared the second. Stood in Petra's kitchen. Petra, who had fed the entire pack for 11 years, without a single acknowledgement from leadership, and received her corrections with a silence that was becoming, slowly and visibly, something resembling humility. The other warriors assigned to service roles were undergoing their own reckonings. Childcare proved particularly instructive. There is something about responsibility for a small person who has no interest in your rank, only in your presence, that reorganizes a wolf's sense of importance with quiet efficiency. By the end of the 3rd week, Garrett, 4 years the compound's most reliably intimidating enforcer, had been overheard singing to a fractious infant at 2 a.m. His voice was surprisingly gentle. He didn't mention it to anyone. Everyone knew anyway. Marek scrubbed floors. Not beside Brand's separate sections, a practical and quietly merciful arrangement. He worked the large cooking vessels, stripped residue from surfaces that resisted every effort, moved through the kitchen in the specific silence of a man renegotiating everything he had previously understood about himself. He was not mistreated. Fenris had stated this plainly in the first gathering after the banquet: no engineered humiliation, no retribution constructed to mirror past cruelties. What Marek received was not punishment. It was reality. The weight of the meals that had always appeared at his table. The labor behind the clean floors he had crossed 1,000 times without curiosity. The invisible daily effort that kept a community functional effort he had spent 15 years standing on without once looking down. He was being shown the foundation. He was learning, for the first time, what it cost. In the courtyard, a child was running. 4 years old, entirely undignified, dark braids coming loose, laughing at something only she perceived. Her name was Mira. 6 weeks prior, she had been pale and still in a sick room, her fever climbing while the pack healer filed her case as difficult and moved on. Now she was chasing a compound cat with total commitment and no apparent strategy. Elder Sira watched from the council chamber doorway. Her seat at the new table was closest to the window, a choice she had made deliberately, having spent enough years in dim rooms being told her perspective was supplementary. The council met twice weekly. The sessions ran long, grew difficult, occasionally fractious. They were also, for the first time in the pack's recent memory, honest. Sira had decided she did not mind difficult, when the alternative had been brief and false. She watched Mira's laughter carry across the courtyard and thought about inscription stone, about 3 words that had waited 3,000 years to become relevant again. What it serves. Every community serves something named or unnamed, chosen or inherited. The question is never whether, but what. What had been dismantled in the banquet hall was not merely a cruel alpha. It was an entire orientation, a pack organized around the performance of dominance and calling that purpose. What was assembling itself now? In the bread baking and the floor scrubbing and the round table arguments, this was something different. A pack learning to serve something worth serving. It would be slow. There would be failures. Real transformation never moved in straight lines. But it had begun. And beginnings, in Sira's experience, were everything. The balcony faced west. Late afternoon light fell across the compound, at the angle that made everything briefly look like its own best version. Stone warm, garden beds bright. The sounds of early evening settling into the productive quiet of a community that had fed itself and was preparing for rest. Fenris stood at the railing with both hands on the stone. No performance of authority, no survey of territory, just attention, the complete, unhurried attention he brought to everything he loved. Vanya stood beside him. They had existed in comfortable silence for several minutes, the specific silence that had always lived easily between them, before something that had been forming in her since the banquet night finally found its shape. "You never told me," she said. He looked at her. The full truth. She held his gaze. "You said you were traveling. No pack. Your name was Fenris, and you knew about herbs, and you liked to cook." A pause. "Those things were all true." "They were," he agreed. "But you allowed me to believe they were everything." "I allowed you to see what was real," he said. "Nothing I showed you was false. I held certain things in reserve. There is a difference." She considered this. Below them, Mira had caught the cat and was sitting in the courtyard cradling it with the satisfaction of someone whose mission is complete. "Why?" Vanya asked. He was quiet in the particular way of someone selecting words carefully because the words matter. "I needed to know you loved Fenris the gardener," he said. "Not the title, not the authority, not something that would have made choosing me easier." He looked at her as direct and unguarded as the first morning she had found him at that garden wall. "I needed to know you chose the man who cooked dinner and held you while you cried, at cost, when it reduced your standing, when every simpler option was available. A pause. And you did. Every single day. Something completed itself in her chest. She laughed, sudden and genuine and slightly undignified, the kind that arrives when the body discovers that a weight it has been carrying has quietly become something lighter. She leaned into him. His arm came around her in the easy, certain way of a man who has held this specific person through enough that the motion lives in his bones. Below them, the compound moved through its evening. Garrett crossed the courtyard with an infant against his chest, both apparently satisfied. Bran was visible through the kitchen window, frowning at a bowl with the expression of someone who has decided to master this regardless of how long it requires. Sierra's lamp glowed in the council chamber. And in every hearth, the great hall, the family quarters, the kitchen where Merrick was learning the weight of what he had taken for granted, the fire burned silver. Not the cold silver of reckoning. Warm, gentle, the silver of something that has stopped hiding and chosen, finally, to simply remain. This is what the ruins remembered. What the inscription carried across 3,000 years to a pack that had forgotten. Strength is not the capacity to destroy. It never was. It is the willingness to remain gentle, long enough, patient enough, steady enough for something worth protecting to grow. In the cleared ground where cruelty once stood, something was growing. Quietly. The way the best things always do. This story is about a truth that power-hungry people never learn in time. Genuine authority doesn't need to announce itself. Fenris never needed to prove his strength. He demonstrated it every day through healing, patience, and love. It was the pack that needed to be ready to see it. Vanya's journey is about loyalty tested to its absolute limit, and being rewarded not with rescue, but with the revelation that the person she chose was worth every sacrifice. And Fenris? He is the answer to a question the world keeps asking wrong. Power isn't something you take. It's something you carry quietly, patiently, and with enough love to stay gentle, even when you could destroy everything around you. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on the notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next. Thank you, and I will see you in my next one.